I am Jim Collison and live from our virtual studios around the world. Although today here in Omaha, Nebraska, this is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on April 28th, 2021. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you join us in our chat room. There's a link right above me there on the live page. Take you to YouTube, and you can sign in and use the chat there. Or if you have questions after the fact, maybe you're listening to the recorded version, you can always send us an email, and many of you do, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to subscribe there if you're on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. You can subscribe and make sure you get these automatically downloaded each and every time we produce them. Dr. Jim Harder is a chief scientist of workplace management and well-being for Gallup's workplace management practice here at Gallup. He's a co-author of the New York Times bestseller 12, The Elements of Great Managing, which we've covered extensively in our Q12 for Coaches series, as well as Well-Being, the 5 Essential Elements, a book we wrote 10 years ago before a lot of people were thinking about the importance of well-being as they are today. And of course, It's the Manager, which has been a bestseller over the last 2 years and been kind of the guidebook for us in a lot of the things that we do around coaching. And so, Jim, welcome to Call to Coach.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
It's a busy season for you, and it's a busy season kind of as we come out of, not everybody, I have to be sensitive to that. Not all countries are coming out of the pandemic at the moment, right? And so being sensitive about that. But it's busy because we and you have been locked down on some research around well-being. Can you just kind of give us an overall, as we kind of come up to speed, as we think about this idea of well-being, especially well-being in the workplace? So we think about the new book coming out on May 4th. Can you kind of give us that elevator pitch overview of where we stand today and why we're thinking about it so much?
Yeah, sure. Just to kind of give people a sense for why we wrote this particular book, since we already have one out on well-being in 2010. That book in 2010 was primarily aimed at how to help individuals improve their own well-being. We did address some organizational issues in there, but just a small amount. This book was 100% aimed at managers, leaders, and organizational culture. So it is really about how an organization can think about their culture. And you might ask, well, why? Well, the reason is, and it started pre-pandemic, actually. If we think about the trends pre-pandemic, we had a newer workforce who is more diverse, more remote working than in the past, more matrix kind of environments where people are working on multiple teams, increases in digitization and mobile technology. People wanted a job with a purpose. They wanted to connect to a purpose. They wanted a job where they can develop. They didn't just want a boss. They wanted a coach. They wanted ongoing conversations. They wanted an organization that leverages their strengths. And they also wanted a workplace that improved their life, not just a job, and not just a job that gives them their paycheck and is separate from the rest of life. That was the trend pre-pandemic. All these things became magnified or amplified during COVID, really, because the pressure was on the workplace to change quickly. We call it the Great Shift, where we went from 4% of people pre-pandemic working full-time from home to 48% full-time at the peak during the pandemic. 70% of people some of the time were working from home. So it was a massive change, and we have still have all kinds of things coming at us. When we see threats to well-being for individuals, it tends to be the result of compounding effects. People are very resilient to one thing going wrong, but when we have all these variables coming at us, in fact, impacting all the 5 elements that we wrote about in the 2010 book, and we can list those off again for you here for those that aren't familiar. But so the workplace plays a big role, and one of the reasons the workplace plays a big role is when we look at engaged workers who aren't thriving in their overall lives, they report a 61% higher rate of burnout often or always than others. So you can be engaged and still burn out. so the rest of your life matters, and that's why it's part of the organization's responsibility, I think, and the organizations of the future, they're really going to do the best job of developing people are going to be those who think about the whole person in a way that's right for them, not forcing it on them, but in a way that makes it comfortable. And we'll get into some of those details here about how organizations we think can do that. The other thing I'd mention about the importance of well-being now, and even pre-pandemic, but now especially, is employment brand. To attract the stars of the future as the workforce starts to change going into the future, and people start having more choices about where they work, they're going to remember what happened during the pandemic, and they're going to choose organizations based on those that help them improve their overall life while they're helping them be productive as well. So those are some of the things, Jim, and so we aimed at all aspects that might influence how an organization can change their overall culture to impact some of these trends we're seeing now. Have historically seen increases in stress and worry globally among workers. Even sadness, even anger has trended upward, unfortunately. And so those are daily experiences that people are having now, and organizations are in a place where they can do something about those trends. And we thought it was the right time we've been digging into data, collected all kinds of data during COVID and pre-COVID, and we don't, as you know, we don't just write a book every year for the purpose of writing a book. We write one when we think we have an accumulation of information that we think we need to share with people.
Yeah, I think I remember early as the pandemic was starting, we were seeing these trends happening, and it was like, we've got some data around this, and we got to kind of get the word out. The book title, Well-Being at Work: How to Build Resilient and Thriving Teams. Jim, is that a follow-up to the first book? You know, I said that in the title here, the 5 Essential Elements, or is it a companion guide for It's the Manager? Is it both? If we think about it from a resourcing standpoint, what would be your hope as we have these coaches in our community very familiar with our work? How would you say you position that book in that kind of light?
Well, we did leverage a lot of our global knowledge of well-being and the 5 elements from our first exploration back in 2010, and prior to 2010 really, but published in 2010. So we have continued to study those 5 elements, and we've continued to update that research. And we leveraged, you'll see some content in this book that is consistent with what you saw in 2010, but it's aimed now at really directed for managers and leaders in terms of how they can impact well-being. So the angle on it is different from the 2010. So I would say if you're going to think about it as being a follow-up to something or a companion to something, I think it'd be It's the Manager, because It's the Manager is aimed at the same audience. And I would actually contend that, and this is a point we make in this book, that It's the Manager and all the content there are the nuts and bolts of managing that make the well-being work much more efficient. Think of It's the Manager as the foundation for impacting well-being in a workplace. So both of them are about how to change culture. It's the Manager is about the basics of getting those conversations right, which opens the door for deeper conversations with people if they allow that.
Yeah, we've been saying the 3 pillars of really healthy workplaces, of course, are strengths-based, engagement-focused, and now this element of a thriving well-being culture. Jim, how can organizations create that? You alluded to that just a second ago. As we think about the opportunities and what we've learned about organizations being able to have an effect on this, what kind of things can they do? And especially today, practically, how could coaches help organizations implement these?
Yeah, I think we've got to start with what we know from a scientific perspective impacts well-being. So what are the actionable areas that an individual and managers can do something about? And so I'd start with those 5 elements of we can all impact our career well-being to some extent. We can all impact our social well-being to some extent, our financial well-being, and our physical well-being, and our community well-being. Those are 5 areas. Let's just start there, that impact the percentage of people who are thriving. We call it Gallup Net Thriving, which is the net of how you think about your life today and how you think your life will be 5 years from now. The net of that is thriving. 7 or above present, 8 or above in the future. And just an interesting side note, interesting to me anyway, was that during the pandemic, the drop occurred on life present. people's perception of their life in the future actually went up a little bit. Maybe that's a contrast effect of, here's my life now, which is, not so great, and then the future is going to be better in 5 years, and people could. So my point is, people could see their way out of this, even though it was such a devastating kind of time to go through for many. But I think if we get grounded in those 5 first and what we can do about each of those 5, that's the first step to changing the culture, because then we know how to direct our energy at different elements that are really going to have a lasting impact on our lives. But I would also say, to change an organizational culture, we need to use those 5 elements as an organizing structure where we connect the different things we offer individuals to those 5, so that whatever we offer somebody makes sense to them in terms of, here's why this exists. They're more likely to remember that it exists if we do that. They're more likely to think about it if they have an issue on one of the 5 elements in their lives. I think in organizations, to change a well-being culture, it's got to start at the CEO level, where it's an intentional part of here's who we want to become. Just like we've seen with engagement, it's got to be very purposeful and intentional, not just stated, but actually role modeled at the executive level and all the way through as it cascades. We've got to equip managers to include well-being in the conversations that they have in the right way that's comfortable. So those 5 conversations we discussed in It's the Manager, well-being fits right in there. It fits really nicely, I think, into the Boss to Coach journey. That if you're doing the Boss to Coach journey right, one of the problems that I've seen in organizations over time is that most well-intentioned initiatives exist in silos, or they're just events, right? And so you've got a performance management thing over here, you've got learning and development programs over here, and you've got an engagement survey over here, and you've got and they're owned by different people even, and so what a Boss to Coach journey should do, or you have a wellness program over here, so you got that also, right? And so what a Boss to Coach journey should do, if it's done right, is to pull those things together and the expertise from all those areas, so that it makes it easy for a manager to know why these things exist and what the resources are. And I think that well-being as a wellness program, most of the data show haven't been greatly effective. Most effective for people who are already on the road to good health, but we can get a lot better if we equip managers to have the right kinds of conversations and upgrade their skills. And so, I think strengths is just an essential part of that. The other thing I'd say is, and this will resonate with this group for sure, is the development of a network of well-being coaches that can not only coach individuals but share best practices. So people improve most on well-being through peers, and the reason for that, I think, is that it's hard for people to take seriously somebody saying what they did if they maybe make twice as much money as them, or in a different situation, right? People, what can people like me do? And there's just an enormous number of examples on each of those 5 elements, creative ideas in terms of how people manage them to get to thriving. And I think there's a lot that a big role well-being coaches can play in sharing those best practices and learning about them over time. So there's just a ton of learning there. The other thing organizations can do, and Gallup can help them with this, I think, is to audit their practices and policies to make sure that to audit how much they're used, for one thing. And a lot of organizations are doing that, but then how does that use connect to improvements in well-being? Whether it's rules and guidelines that the organization has, or how they communicate things, or the facilities they have in place, or different incentives they have in place, they work for or against when you look at it. Improvements in well-being, how people are recognized, what kind of events are offered, and of course development programs. And we can evaluate organizations on that, give them some feedback on just how much awareness is there, how much involvement is there in the organization on that, what's the impact, and what are the other important thing is, what are the interrelatedness components of the 5 elements. One key to getting these right for individuals and organizations is to think about how they how they are interrelated. So if I'm working on something, how many of those 5 elements does it impact? Your chance for improvement goes up if you've got multiple well-being elements involved in what you're trying to get done.
Jim, we spend a bunch of time in the book kind of tying well-being and strengths together, and this is really the first time I've seen us do it in this kind of form. Can you talk a little bit about why and what, and just give a few details on resources that are going to be available inside the book for our, our Gallup certified coaches or enthusiasts around the world? How could they use this and tie strengths into well-being?
Yeah, so the way we thought about strengths in the context of well-being is really that we shouldn't expect everybody to be this superstar athlete or to have to become what maybe some inspirational person is that might be running them through a program or whatever it is. I shouldn't have to become an athlete to improve my physical well-being. I shouldn't have to be a multimillionaire to have high financial well-being, because financial well-being comes down to how we manage our money to reduce our daily stress and increase our long-term security. Those are the 2 outcomes of people with thriving financial well-being, or how you experience your days through your money and your long-term, and how you use your money really to have the right kinds of experiences, so that it lasts and it doesn't just fade away. Mm-hmm. And physical, the outcome should be, how do I increase my daily energy so I can get done what I need to get done, regardless of what situation we're in. Many people have some form of disease burden that they had no part in, and it's about figuring out ways to manage your daily life so that you can do what you want to do. And of course, there are important elements underneath that, like what we eat and how the quality of our sleep, which is often overlooked, and then the how much we move around. In this particular book, we did include a chapter reviewing some of George Gallup's really early work on what he called them the oldsters, people who lived to be 95 plus, and they moved around a lot through their work. We call this exercise nowadays, but they just moved a lot, and they ate smaller meals, and they weren't as selective about what they ate. But back then, this is in the late 50s, early 60s. Back then, there weren't as many processed foods, so that probably played to their advantage also. But to get back on topic here, Jim, the strengths plays into this because it builds some efficiency in terms of how we can aim who we naturally are at improving each one of those. It shouldn't be such a big mountain to climb to improve on these 5 elements, and sometimes it feels that way because we feel like we have to be like this person over here. And go to the gym and be like the gym rat, and that's fine for a lot of people, but it doesn't fit for everybody. And so that's why in terms of resources, we've got an appendix that a bunch of us, many of which you've seen on this show. Jacqueline Robinson is one of them, Jim Asplin, Austin, but a bunch of folks here at Gallup spent some time going through each one of those strengths and looking at how each of those strengths tie to each one of these each of the 34 strengths tie to each of the 5 well-being elements, to give people a starting point in thinking about how whatever strengths they have or their employee might have, or the person they're coaching might have. Here are some ideas about how they might improve that well-being element through those particular strengths. So that's an appendix. We also have an appendix that is a manager guide. It could also be used as a coaching guide that will take you through some example questions. By the way, on that strengths to well-being piece, this group is going to just have incredible depth to add to those. Mm-hmm. Think about that appendix as a starting point, but I think we have just a great amount of learning to do as we keep studying this. A lot of green grass out there for us to explore.
Mm-hmm. We, 12 years ago or so, I joined Gallup 14 years ago, and it took me a year or two to kind of get all the way into the culture. I met Ryan Wolf, who we began kind of a journey on physical well-being together. And it's not all about that, but I always kind of think I think secretly played to my Ranger Woo combination, because I always wanted to, I didn't want to win things. I used to, you and I ran a lot together in those years.
Yeah.
We did the same races together and spent some time running. You were fortunately always faster than me, and so I
don't remember that.
I strive to be like Jim Harder. But using those themes, I figured out I was a social runner. That's kind of what I named. Like, I didn't run because I liked running. I ran because I liked being and winning people. That was the more people we could get at a race, the bigger the crowd, the more participation we would get. I think we got to a point where we had 120 or something register for Corporate Cup. I was the mouthpiece for helping the recruiting, right? I think it was a great example of being able to tie my strengths into some of our well-being initiatives. And by the way, well-being initiatives aren't just physical activities. I think sometimes wellness programs become about physical activities or diets, right? And there's so much more to that. Jim, a question I got from the chat room a couple times, and you and I addressed this a little bit as we talked about resiliency through Clifton Strengths, a series we did at the end of 2020 together. You covered community and social well-being. Where do the areas of, and this is a little bit off topic, but let me address it. Where do the areas, when we think about mental or emotional or spiritual, these other well-being terms, how do those fit into this? Is it an exhaustive list, or are there room for other areas of well-being to be explored as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one we've thought about a lot, actually, and thought even more about lately as we've seen all these trends in mental health. People are reporting, the U.S. Census Bureau and CDC reported a third of people have in this past year have had incidents of signs or symptoms of depression, anxiety. And that's more than double if you go back to 2014, it's more than double that trend. So the mental health issue is a really big one to be thinking about. At Gallup, we're not experts at the treatment of mental health, and that's not an area that we're seeking to become experts at. But we do think that as organizations improve their cultures, and we got evidence of this, they can reduce the chance of mental health issues in the future. So it's kind of getting ahead of it. Where there's EAPs to take care of that, it's getting ahead of it. So how does it fit into our dimensionality here? And I'll talk about spirituality too, but think about mental health or emotional health as one of many outcomes of getting these 5 elements right. So it kind of sits underneath all 5 to some extent. They all predict various mental health symptoms that we have been able to track in the past. And emotional health, they're all predictors of how people experience their days emotionally. They're leading indicators of new incidents of depression and anxiety, that is if they're low. So I would think about the 5 elements as these are 5 areas everybody can act on, no matter where they're at in the world. They can do something about each of these 5 to some extent, or at least there's possibility there for improvement. And that improvement will relate to better emotional health and reduced chance of other mental health issues. You're going to ask something, Jim?
No, keep going.
Okay. Spirituality, we did a bunch of study of that as well, and religiosity. We looked at it globally and in some of our longitudinal panel studies. And what we found is that spirituality, well, let me say it a different way. These 5 elements are mediators of the impact of spirituality or religiosity on well-being outcomes, like how people evaluate their lives and their emotional health. So think about these 5 as mediators. It's almost like you could interpret from those data that if you have got healthy spirituality or religiosity, it's going to flow through each of those 5, and you could direct that at those 5. So think about those as kind of being in the middle of spirituality, religiosity, and some of those important outcomes, like how we think about our overall lives and how we experience our days. The other thing I'd say, I was talking with Deepak Chopra when we first came out with that Wellbeing 5 book in 2010, and he said these 5 elements are spirituality. So there's that. It's kind of an interesting way to think about it. The other thing I'd say about spirituality, and the reason it isn't like a separate dimension of like a sixth dimension, is that when we studied it globally, its impact on life evaluation and daily emotions varied quite a bit around the world. So these five, we saw consistent relationships around the world. It varied. In fact, it was more strongly predictive in more religious societies. So it wasn't quite as generalizable as these five.
Yeah, I loved in the very beginning of the first book, you talk about these are 5 elements that we discovered in the millions of interviews we did globally around the world, and we're able to put them together in a way, one, we could measure them, and two, we could make a difference in. And I don't think they're exhaustive or the only 5 that are out there. I get this question a lot from our coaching community, but what about? I love that your answer to that is that they're an underlying foundation of all of them. And so we get this opportunity then to see through those, whether it's emotional or spiritual, we get to see those elements through the lens, I like to say it, which we see those through those. A comment from chat said, why at least perceived need to shift the responsibility of personal well-being from individual to their employer. I see the apparent shift is, we've said now it's the manager, and we're also putting out a workplace book on well-being. Doesn't this lead the training away from personal agency? Jim, you and I were talking a little bit about that in the pre-show. How do you feel about that? Are we taking the onus off the individual with this?
I don't think so at all. It might. I could see how that might be perceived, but it's really about. So it is ultimately on the individual, much like even engagement, you could say, has a lot to do with what that individual does, but the manager is in a position where they can set the tone. They can direct people to the right resources in the organization at a very basic level. At a higher level, they can listen to someone and think about how their life is going. I would argue that managers and coaches are in the best position to help individuals impact well-being because they're close to the action. They're in a position where they can understand their life situation. They can understand their work, their goals. They can help. They're in a position to understand what team they're on, what purpose they're going after, what metrics that they're tracking in terms of their life overall, how they're developing, what kind of strategy they have in place for their future. I think I mentioned team, and they're in position to think about help an individual think about their well-being. So ultimately it is the individual, and with well-being, with well-being in particular, it's a little touchier than engagement because engagement's very much directed at what's going on at work. I think the best thing a coach or a manager can do is open the door to have those conversations, and I think that happens through setting the right kind of culture so that people naturally feel comfortable and don't feel awkward about it. I also think strengths is such an important part because it reduces those awkward conversations. You're starting with who that person is in a common language. So I think it's both, but I think organizations haven't done a good enough job up to now of putting a culture in place that supports that. So you got individuals who are trying to do the right thing for themselves, and you got organizational pressures and policies and cultures that are working against what they're trying to get done for themselves. So the point is, organizations play a huge role in setting the tone, I guess, and supporting what individuals are already trying to get done.
Yeah, a both and approach, right?
Yeah.
Of tackling it from both sides. As you were talking, I was thinking, wow, well-being is almost like a personal engagement measure. In some ways, how am I? We use the Q12 to kind of measure how we're doing at work. But as I think about those elements, career well-being is certainly a part of that. But all those other elements really bring this idea of personal engagement. How am I engaging with the planet around me? With those, personally doing that. If I was an individual, this book the title may position it at the workplace, but if I was an individual and I may be struggling at this point, Jim, how can I, what kind of steps could I take right away, or what kind of things have we found are helpful to getting back into a thriving state? Because we have a lot of people suffering at this point.
Yeah, and in the U.S., it's more struggling, I think.
Okay.
Because suffering is a real desperate state. On that scale I was giving you earlier from 0 to 10, someone's suffering is at 4 and below present and 4 and below future. So they're feeling pretty hopeless, and that's a smaller percentage in the U.S. and a smaller percentage globally, but it's still it's an important chunk of the population, and some people have gone into suffering. The first thing that I'd say is to take note of the 5 elements we can do something about, to think about them holistically. They are independent but also interdependent elements of our lives so to think about them holistically means that we're best if we think about how we can get involved in activities and set goals around things that impact multiple domains. But even before all that, to start with strengths is really important, because that's a foundation that makes everything else more efficient. So I know this group already knows that, but I'll restate it anyway. I think we can aim our strengths at each one of those elements, and it just makes it a lot easier. We're not expecting to be somebody else. We're kind of working through our own tendencies, and then we can develop. Think about well-being elements almost as competencies that you can continue to get better at. The other thing I would say is that we should all kind of recognize that everybody's on this journey, and not too many people are all the way there. Everybody's got stuff they're working on, and I don't think we should expect that people think that other people have these lives where they're maxing out on each of those 5 elements. It's just not. We don't see it in the data, and I think if you sat down and everybody had honest conversations about them, they would have things that they would improve on. So I think knowing that we're all in the same boat, at least in the sense that we have things to work on, is important too. That's why I think that those peer kind of connections are really important. How do we partner with other people like us that we can learn ideas from in each of those areas, and in many cases work together on. I think we can all sit down and assess ourselves on each of those 5. In our 2010 book, we did put an instrument in there that anybody could take that will give them a measurement on where they're at, but I don't know that it's necessary. I mean, it's there, but I think anybody can sit down and ask themselves questions about each of those 5, just like we have in that manager guide as a resource in the book, and just having the conversation. I think much like strengths, the important thing is that we improve productive conversations, and that we don't just assess, here's your score, and move on. It's more, how do we have a conversation so that it leads to something better.
Yeah, that I appreciate you saying that, because sometimes that Q12 score, the score itself can be distracting from the conversations that need to be had around teams, around organizations, about what do those numbers actually mean. And if it becomes more about the number, I just recently went back. The Wellbeing Finder is what we called it in those days, and it's still there. It still works. You can take it. But I was always then thinking, I was kind of gaming that. I took it a couple times, and I'd game it because I wouldn't want my score to be lower than the second or third or fourth time that I took it. And so a great opportunity to kind of review, at least for me, to kind of think, okay, no, wait a minute. The importance here is how I feel during the pandemic, during the year. I would say my physical well-being took a hit, but I know that I'm having conversations about that. It's a temporary thing until we return to some, the fitness center that we have at Gallup is very, very important for me. That became a routine and a habit that I got into, that I got out of when we were no longer there. So it's I love that. Jim, are there other resources? So we talked a little bit about some workplace, some organizational helps in there. We talked about, we wrote some things around integrating strengths into this. Other resources that are a part of the book, just as we kind of wrap this, that you'd like to highlight in there that folks could use out of the book?
Well, the book, what we try to do is make this as actionable as possible. And so we've listed off there's a ton of research we've listed in the back of the book, but we've listed off a number of what we think are actions individuals and organizations can take on each of the 5 elements related to their work. And a really important point in my mind is that there is an order to those 5 elements. And even though, if somebody is suffering on any of them, of course, that's their priority. If somebody has extreme physical pain, they got to take care of that. If they're living in an unsafe area, that's got to be the priority. If they're bankrupt, that's got to be a priority to fix that. And if they're lonely and they don't have good relationships, they got to fix that. But career well-being is the most foundational, and I'd make social well-being a very close second to that. And the reason has to do with how many kind of tentacles those two have, and how much they impact the rest of our life in terms of the amount of time we spend in each of those areas. And they set us up for success in financial, physical, and community well-being if we get them right. And a point about those two is that if we start first on those engagement elements, that's why I think that the It's a Manager piece is kind of a foundation for this. Then we're already working on those first two, career and social. They're embedded in there, and so at least in a work context, we're helping people improve on their careers and their social well-being if we're getting those engagement elements right. And then it's a matter of thinking about how we can open the door even further. Those two will build trust. When you build trust, you've got a better chance of having good, productive conversations on these deeper well-being issues.
Jim, you've alluded to this and here throughout, but I'll ask it again because I think it's important in the context of this conversation. When we think about our certified coaches or coaches in organizations having an impact in this area, what kind of advice would you give them today to say, here's 2 or 3 things? You just gave one saying that career and social are super important in this, and we don't want to miss those. Any other piece of advice that you give to coaches as you would kind of help them in orgs or with individuals around this?
These coaches are like experts on this, so it's kind of hard to give them advice, Jim. They're dealing with people all the time. I bet they'll have a lot of advice to send my way. I'd like to learn from all of them. But I think we've got to keep it very as simple and practical to start off with. And what can we achieve now? What can we help someone achieve in the short term to give them confidence that they can move this in the right direction? If they're an activator, it might be around rallying people to improve social well-being. If they're analytical, it might be connecting to other people through insights and problem solving and sharing knowledge with others. In financial well-being, if they're competitive, maybe it's some form of gamification, or maybe they get a boost out of comparing themselves to others on finances. If they're a developer, it might help the developer who really wants to always spend a lot of time. Maybe sometimes they'll spend too much time on others, not themselves, from a financial perspective, to help them know how them making money can impact others through charity or some other means. So I think there's just all kinds of creative ways of thinking about how we help individuals through their strengths on these 5.
Okay. Good advice. And, I think we all can come to this together like we did with It's the Manager when that book released. It's a community. We spent a bunch of time figuring out ways to use it. We saw book clubs pop up. We saw folks jumping on and talking about it online. We saw all kinds of different advice around that. So we welcome that in our Facebook groups. If you're one of our certified coaches or enthusiasts, strengths champions around the world, we'll continue this conversation. We're excited to get that book in your hands. And we also know if you're registered before May 15th for the Gallup at Work Summit, you'll get that book free as part of the physical box we'll be sending out, as well as a cool little well-being gadget that's coming included with that as well. So you can get that, or you can pre-order it right now as well. Jim, a couple questions came in, really specific questions. So we're going to kind of work our way through these. Nancy had asked, to what extent did employees cite psychological safety as an important element in the workplace environment? Does that show up in our research anywhere, this idea of psychological safety?
Yeah, if you kind of break down psychological safety, it overlaps with a lot of the concepts that we measure in engagement and well-being, particularly when you think about the elements that relate the most to feelings of inclusion and belonging. And there's belonging components in engagement. belonging. If you, as we're tracking data through COVID in organizations that we're working on engagement, we continue to see increases in those elements during, and again, this is a subset of organizations that are actually working on trying to improve it. So organizations that we're working with, but the social component, having a best friend at work, for instance, didn't see quite as much growth as we normally see. So being in these different locations and remote, particularly, we saw a pattern with newer employees. So newer employees, and I think that's something that we have to be really conscientious about as we move forward and as organizations continue to evolve through this situation, is to think about how different employees in different situations are going to have different needs socially. So longer term employees like Jim and I, we get on video, and it's just like the same, almost. But longer term employees have already established relationships and some trust, and so it's easy to maintain friendships from that perspective. But the newer employees, I think it's tougher. So how we onboard people effectively, there's some keys to onboarding we wrote, and it's the manager that I think could be leveraged there. But and one big one is how do who are my partners? And so we got to speed that up and find ways, maybe even in a safe way, have some more in-person time with the newer people, and so that we can build that trust. But that's a part of psychological safety. Feeling cared about in engagement is a part of psychological safety. At a basic level, it's feeling like you're treated with respect. That's a real key to people feeling safe anywhere. It's almost like an assumed thing, but less than half of people will strongly agree that they're treated with respect. And if you don't strongly agree, if you even get a 4 to that one, you see all kinds of negative things. So those are some kind of top of mind thoughts. It's a great question.
Yeah, I know when the pandemic started, there were a few new employees that I reached out to and said, "Can I just schedule some time with you every week? Because I know you're brand new, and I want to make sure you succeed through this time." We didn't know how long it was going to be, but a great opportunity to reach out to them and make sure they continue to be contacted with and have time with. We started a bunch of new employees on Monday, and it was fun to see that we haven't onboarded anybody in a while. And so they did some things for them that were in person and will continue to be virtual. So I think we got some challenges ahead. Marcia asked this question about neuroscience. Do you see an integration of neuroscience as an important resource to aim strengths to improving your wellness?
I think neuroscience can help us, and we've done some work on this, particularly with our first study we did on customer engagement. But I think neuroscience can help us understand why, and help us explain why. We actually just got a proposal from somebody to do some work on this with strengths, but which would be kind of interesting to follow up on that. So we're just considering which parts of the brain light up, when you discuss areas that are your strengths versus areas that aren't. So I think it can help us understand and provide more clarity around why strengths are so important. We can look at how strengths relate to outcomes. We've done big meta-analyses on that. But another example is we did an employee engagement study looking at how engaged employees physiologically react. So we found that less engaged employees have actually more of the hormone cortisol in the mornings than people who are engaged, and so that's the stress hormone. So it kind of helps us understand and explain, what's actually going on, and make tangible what's actually going on inside of us when we experience these things. And it's another form of validation too. Neuroscience is kind of tricky though. It's a different way of looking at data, because it's a ton of observations on a small sample. So it can it's kind of anecdotal in that sense, in that you can take it and say, well, this is kind of an interesting way of looking at how with these repeated measures on the same people, they responded to these kind of stimuli.
Yeah. Marta gets I think, the prize for the best question, by the way. So, Marta, this is awesome. And I think it's the elephant in the closet in every Q12 is this idea of having a best friend at work, right? And so, has the best friend notion shifted to a virtual connection? So, have we seen anything? I think, Jim, you alluded to this a little bit when we first started, but because we're virtual, we don't see each other. Have we seen through our Q12 data, and I think later on here this year we're going to release some new reports around this. But have we seen a change? Has that taken a hit? Best friends taken a hit at
Well,
work?
it's still extremely important, but I would also make sure everybody understands it's not always the first thing you work on. The foundational issues like expectations, getting people's roles right, getting people in the right jobs, doing what they do best. You get those right, then the friendships become very dynamic and innovative and powerful in organizations. On the other hand, if you don't get those basics right, then friendships can be kind of co-destructive. So there's that. But as we're tracking through the pandemic, its best friend, that particular item was more difficult to improve on than the others. So for people that and largely because people were working remote again, and we know that working remote, we had more challenges, and social distancing, all that created a lot more challenges in terms of in terms of our social well-being. And we know that all forms of social time count. We've seen that in the data, whether it's video like this or whether it's even email or any kind of connections help, but in-person time matters more. It doesn't mean, this is an important takeaway too, I think, it doesn't mean we have to have in-person time all the time though. In-person time matters up to a point. So it's almost like the event of the in-person time matters more than the total amount of time. So that's kind of something to kind of take note of too.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So just scheduling them, I think the in-person times in a safe way is important to do if we can, because it boosts your well-being a little bit more. It's something in our human psyche but I think the video does help some. You can at least, we can get like a one-on-one. I like the one-on-one videos because you can really have a kind of normal conversation.
Mm-hmm.
If when you get like 100 people on a screen, it's you don't really know, you can't really sense what people are feeling.
Sure. Well, but those kinds of meetings have their own purpose.
They're more functional.
Yeah. To get, I think about, we shifted our year-end awards ceremony from in person, which was always a big party, to virtual, and I think we did a pretty good job, but I think we've got some improvement to do on it. And by the way, it had an unintended consequence of making our global employees feel more included in this. And so we began to kind of think through, okay, how do we keep this virtual because it worked better for everybody, but continue to tweak it to make it better for everybody in the process. I think there's never an end point to that. But we probably wouldn't have discovered that if we hadn't been forced into that model. I think this has been a really beneficial factor for us at Gallup and some of the things we've learned. Jim, last question for you, a little bit of personal, but how are you doing in your well-being, like coming out of the pandemic? We lived through it as well. How are you doing? And are there, you research this thing every day. Are there areas for you? Like if you were going to think about like, yeah, this has slipped a little bit for me. And any insight there? Be as transparent as you'd like answering that question.
Well, there's kind of two sides to it. On the one side, I've learned some things that I kind of knew, but I didn't really hit home enough in the past. That working from home, I had a good setup for it pre-pandemic, and I always scheduled some time working from home because I have high focus, and but I realized how much I can get done without a commute. that's one thing. But the other side of it is, and I have to get absorbed, and so those long periods of time to get absorbed help a lot, especially when you're trying to write a book during a pandemic. And trying to write a book in the summer is when we kind of did a lot of the main content. That's challenging because there's a lot to do in the summer. It's easier to write a book in in the winter, especially Nebraska winter. On the social side, though, I think, and I think we have to be. I think I have to be, and everybody needs to be strategic about how we manage our social well-being going forward. That we might learn things like that, but like to give you another kind of personal example is, if I had my druthers, I would probably just sit home and read a book or something. And I have a spouse who forces me into social interaction. I ended up enjoying it. So I think we've got to be strategic and have partners that help nudge us to make sure that social in-person time happens when it can happen safely. But I think so. As we're kind of coaching people, I think that strategy part of well-being is really important, about what is my strategy for how I'll improve each of these areas, and how can I actually make that work in partnership with in the social realm, in partnership with the people that I'm wanting to be social with, right? Mm-hmm. So, and this is a challenge for organizations going forward in the near term is, okay, most are saying we're going to have this hybrid type environment, or they're going to try to do that, right? How do I do that in such a way so that when I'm in the office, my coworkers are too, so we can actually collaborate, which is the reason why we're here. So we can, collaborate in person. And so I think, so people might say, well, I'm going to go in the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week or wherever it is. Well, how do we make sure that some of those days overlap so we can actually...
A little more coordination on that. I've found myself doing that now as we're making our way back in, and we're starting to set, okay, Tuesday is going to be the day, and we're all going to come in just to try to coordinate it to kind of help, because there is a certain momentum that happens as people physically arrive, and it's just different. That that's one of the areas of the pandemic I underestimated. But as many of us went home, not everybody was able to do that, and a lot of people in essential jobs continue to go to work. But for those in that kind of situation, it's been harder to restart that engine than I anticipated of getting people back in the office. And so there's that struggle as well. Jim, I'm glad that your wife did such a great job because of getting you out to more social events, because some of the best conversations I've had with you have been at some of those events as we're standing around talking. So it's always great to see you. Thanks for taking the time. It's a particularly busy time for you. Pre-show we were talking, you've got plenty of podcast interviews and all kinds of things happening as we get ready to launch the book. Again, Well-Being at Work. The launch date for that is May 4th, available where most books are sold. You can pre-order it. We'll have a link to it in the show notes here. Jim, thanks for taking the time today to be a part of this, and appreciate it. We can't cover everything, but we sure gave it a try. Thanks for coming out today. I appreciate it.
Great to be with everybody again.
Jim, hang tight for me 1 second. I'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we do have available. And if you head to Gallup.com and just search Well-Being at Work, you'll actually find our post on this and be able to pre-order the book if you want to do it that way. If it's after May 4th, 2021, I'm sure it's available. Just search Gallup, search Well-Being at Work, and you can find that available there. If you're interested in coaching, master coaching, or become a Gallup certified strengths coach, or we mentioned this early in the conversation today, maybe your organization would love Gallup's help in kind of doing a well-being audit. We do that as well. You can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. We'll get somebody to get back with you right away on that as well. If you want to follow our webcasts, we have a whole bunch coming up, and they continue to be very, very successful in a lot of the things we're doing. You can follow us on Eventbrite. Go to gallup.eventbrite.com and just follow us there. You'll get a notification whenever we do something new. Jim, we mentioned the Gallup at Work Summit that's coming up. You're of course you're speaking at the summit. What's your session on?
Well-Being at Work.
Yeah, there we go.
Vipula Gandhi and I are going to be doing a session there, and there's I think 3 on well-being at the summit at least. Yeah. So there'll be plenty of content covered.
June 8th and 9th, 100% virtual, and you can join us from anywhere in the world. Your registration, gallupatwork.com, and our certified coaches get a discount as well. You can find us anywhere on our social platforms by searching Clifton Strengths, and we want to thank you for joining us today. And thanks for coming out, Jim. Again, thanks for joining us today. If you found this useful, we'd love to have you share it, and so we appreciate you doing that as well. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.